All of us are familiar with dogs. We've all lived in and amongst dogs, even if we're not dog lovers or dog owners. We know lots of dogs as individuals. Every single one of them biologically is a gray wolf. They're not related to gray wolves. They actually are gray wolves. So some of the breeds, you can really see that. It's easy to understand if we see like any of the Alaskan sled dog type breeds, or we see even a German Shepherd, you can look at that and go, I see the wolf in that. But you start to get down to like a Shih Tzu or a Pit Bull or a little terrier, and you don't see the gray wolf anymore. You see that domestication has changed them. So the gray wolf is Canis lupus and the domesticated dog is Canis lupus familiaris. And we add that trinomial part, that last epithet to its name, to designate that it's been domesticated. So you can see that as something's moved away from wild nature and its diet is changed and its environmental conditions are changed, and most importantly, probably sexual selection becomes a factor, right? We think a lot about natural selection, how the environment shapes us. What we forget is the incredible power wielded usually by females of a species to select mates. And that will drive radical changes in phenotype. So, you look at some of the bird species, let's say in the Amazon, and you think like, how did natural selection choose these radical colors and feather designs? Well, that's not natural selection, not the environment. That's the selection by females of mates, right? Well, with domestication, we get into artificial selection. So we change the environment. So it's no longer natural selection, it's not the environmental pressure, and we become the sexual selectors who we want to breed. And over time, we can, in actually a fairly short period of biological time, we can take a gray wolf and turn it to a Chihuahua. We've done that with a lot of species. We've done that with cows and sheep and goats, and we've done that with a host of plants. We're working on mushrooms and bacteria and algae and all these things right now, domesticating the world. In the process, I don't think we ever set out to domesticate ourselves, but in the process we did inadvertently domesticate ourselves. It's important to understand the timeline that this has happened in, because human beings, we get new archaeological evidence all the time, and now genomics and genetics has shown us we're able to peer a little bit deeper into our origins, but we know that we're at least in our current form, we're something like 300,000 years old, right? We've been around for 300,000 years as modern humans. But humans as a genus Homo, goes back a lot farther, right? And all of us were hunter-gatherers. That's our wild type, right? Most of us only interact with human beings of the domestic type. But the wild type hunts and gathers. It's something like 10,000 years ago. Some would say 14,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago. Something between 10 and 14,000 years ago, human beings started in the Fertile Crescent, started to plant things. Right? We went from this idea of tending to the wild, and this is not a like surviving hand to mouth kind of a thing. People had gotten very good at getting food resources out of their environment and also interacting with the environment to make it more productive. We tended the wild. We were like gardeners of the wild landscape. But this idea to start planting starts around 10 to 14,000 years ago. And very quickly, we shift away from being hunter-gatherers in that area of the world to being domestic, to starting going away from this idea of annual migration routes through our range, where we would go from our sort of winter camp to our spring camp to our summer camp, following migrations of animals, following the ripening of plants, getting away from insects like mosquitoes and things like that. You learn, okay, in the summer we don't want to be down here, we're going to go up here. But once we start planting, now we need to kind of guard that area, right? We need to weed it, we need to till it, we need to keep animals away from it. So people start to settle down. And this is the first time that we become sedentary, right? Because prior to that, we're not of the house. Like you said, domestication means of the household. We weren't of the house. We might have been of the tent, right? Because we'd bring things with us. But for the first time, people start settling down. Very quickly, shockingly fast, out of that starts to emerge the city-states. About 7,000 years ago, we start seeing the first city-states emerge. And what we have now is enough surplus food to create an environment where you can have a class of people who can sit at the top and not have to forage anymore, not have to hunt anymore. In a hunter-gatherer community, everybody's like a sovereign individual, and it's an egalitarian system. Everyone does overlapping jobs to make sure that everyone's fed. Everybody forages, everybody hunts. The chief does, and the runt of the litter does. Everybody participates equally and together. But now you have this system where, through growing grains primarily, right? In Mesopotamia, we're talking about wheat. But if we get over to Asia, another center of domestication, we're talking about rice. If we go over to Mesoamerica, we see another center of domestication that arises later based around maize, or what we now call corn. So we have several centers of domestication, but they tend to focus on growing a grass. So all those plants I just mentioned, wheat, barley's another one, rice, corn, those are all grasses. Their seeds we call grains, and we can produce surplus food by doing that. So this is the first time human beings have more food than they can eat. Hunter-gatherers tend to have this sort of daily subsistence or weekly subsistence, right? It's like we harvest enough for what we need, and as it runs down, we go out and we get more of it, right? The hunters go out when the meat resource starts to be depleted, right? The foragers go out when the plant resource, some is stored, but lots of it's just sort of eaten up. But for the first time, now we have all this surplus grain, and now we can feed more people. So immediately what happens is the population starts to grow, because people are made out of, turns out, we're made out of food, right? And that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. They talk about and think about how we deal with a population problem. If you keep adding surplus food into any population, you'll have a population problem. Barring that you somehow sterilize individuals, I mean, people will continue to reproduce because there's enough surplus carbon to make more people. And so you start to have people settle down, and then quickly they start to grow and multiply. And then you start to get a stratified society, because you need somebody to sort of watch over the grain. And then you need somebody to determine how to distribute the grain. And then you got to start having rules about that. So now you got to have sort of like a legal class. And well, how do you enforce that? Well, now you need like an enforcement class. Well, who sits on the top of that? You start to quickly develop a hierarchical system, which is not our natural way of living. So in the same way that for dogs, let's say, for dogs interacting in a household environment, like a wolf is a pack animal. We say lone wolf sometimes, but there aren't really lone wolves. It might be lone coyotes, but wolves, no. They are a pack animal. They're a social animal. This idea of a dog living alone in a house with a couple of people, not normal for dogs. Can work, but not normal for dogs biologically. That's not their biological norm. Living in a hierarchical structure where you have a ruling class and a policing and military class and an educational class, and then you get down to a sort of a worker class, that's not our natural way of being. We can make it work to some degree, but that's not our biological norm. But that's what came out of domestication. This all starts like 10,000 years ago. So again, if we took this timeline, here's 300,000 years. And this whole time we hunt and gather. And then 10,000 years ago, and it's not like 10,000 years ago, we call this thing the Neolithic Revolution, the first planting. It makes it sound like it just caught fire and went around the world. I would point out that this is not even a complete revolution yet. There are people all around the world still hunting and gathering. And I don't mean people like myself who've taken it on as a modern practice, but I mean true subsistence hunters and gatherers, like we would find some in the Amazon, what we call the uncontacted tribes. We'd find some in New Guinea, we'd find some in Africa that have not bought into the agricultural model yet. We're very close. And it's like, it hurts to say it, but in my lifetime, there'll probably be no more true wild subsistence lineages left in the world. I mean, they're all shifting over now as they're drawn into or voluntarily come into what we call the modern world. But it's not like 10,000 years ago, everybody on the planet switched to this, right? Just in this one area. And then that started to spread there, and then it crops up in Peru, it crops up in Mexico, it crops up in Asia, and you get these domestication centers. Well, what they tend to do is need more land. They're growing their population, they go out, they conquest, they take more land, but this happens slowly, and we're not even fully there yet. So when we look at that timeline, when did humans get domesticated? Well, it's like right here, some humans did in this 300,000 year timeline, and then that's not even all of them until we're almost there. It's basically happened yesterday in biological terms. We are not yet adapted to living this way. We don't really know how to live this way. The pace of technology is so fast that biologically we can't stay up to speed with it. We're trying, but things keep changing. We got domesticated and didn't even realize it. But unlike a dog, we wear more of like an invisible kind of collar and an invisible leash, right? Because it's like an unseen hand where the dog knows you're the master, right? Telling it what it can and can't do, setting the rules and feeding it. But we sort of have we have a sense in our culture of our freedom, but we're much more like free range cattle than we are like free human beings, right? And so there's a saying, the next step after free range isn't freedom. It's a slaughterhouse, right? We don't raise ourselves for meat. We don't eat people, thankfully, but we certainly raise ourselves for the labor force, right? That's kind of what we do. We live on like a human factory farm in a way, raised up for the labor force, told that if we work hard, we'll have some kind of freedom. But the thing is, we all know as we become adults, it's kind of like a trap in that you can't ever really get free. It'd be more fair to say we're free range. So at this point, human domestication is 7 billion people, most of whom live on like a giant human factory farm. In some places, it's more like a CAFO, some parts of the world, right? Sometimes we call that the third world, or we call that the developing world, where they're struggling. It's much harder. There's a lot less freedom to move. And then some places where we, in the more developed nations where people have this sense of all this economic freedom, I'd say it's more like a really nice free range farm, the one you want to see on the box of eggs when you get them, the pastured, where we can move about freely, but we don't have the true freedom that hunter-gatherers had. And that's the kind of freedom most of us can't even really imagine anymore. The number of indigenous peoples that were in the world and are in the world, the number of languages and language groups, and there are certain things that we can see that are sort of transcultural and ubiquitous. There's this sort of way of seeing the environment. Well, there's human people, but then there's like the deer people, right? Or the giraffe people, or whatever is like this personage to living creatures. It's not humans, and then everything else is like a thing that you can just take. Like everything's just a blank noun that you can just take, right? Instead, it's this understanding that we're a type of animal, or it might be more fair to say with a lot of natural peoples that it'd be like more, we're like a spiritual entity in this place, and so are these other beings, and therefore there's a built-in respect that our monotheistic religions didn't necessarily instill into us culturally, and that might not have been a problem initially when we were small enough, but now that we have scaled out and covered the globe, now it's a real problem if we interact with the environment like that. If we continue to interact with the environment like everything here is a spiritless resource, or a resource that doesn't require respect, or if it's only seen in an economic way. That's what we're starting to see, that change, and it's good, but it's not enough. I don't think it will keep pace. It'd be like, well, we're not going to see trees as like living creatures, even though they are, right? Or beings, even though technically they are beings. Instead, we'll see them as an economic resource, and we'll think about it like a bank account. Like, let's not spend more trees than we're growing so that we never hit negative, right? We don't ever want to go into the red. That will lead to more trees at some level, but I don't think it's enough, and it's certainly not enough in here, where we truly feel an emptiness because we're lonesome. Man, we're lonesome. It's like, thank goodness we have a best friend, dogs, another domesticated animal. Otherwise, right, like us and our dogs and our cats, we're pretty lonely in the world because we have created a relationship of emotional isolation from our environment. You could think of it like this: if we were to say, let's say we were going to go to a trekking party, like let's say some Westerners from, the UK, Europe, and the States are going trekking in the Himalaya. And then we grab like some indigenous folks who are living a traditional life way. So I'm talking about some of these like more uncontacted tribes. And we look at the two side by side. For sure, the trekkers look almost like astronauts compared to the indigenous people, who look much more like a type of animal on the landscape, a tool-using animal, so unique, right? One that has the ability with both brain and digits to manipulate the environment. So certainly we're a special animal, we're unique, but they look like part of the landscape. We are enclosed in tech fabrics, boots that insulate us from the ground, packs full of stuff. You put an astronaut like from the Apollo moon landing here and put the trekker here and the indigenous person here, who does the trekker look more like? They look more like the astronaut. The amount of equipment necessary for us to just go into the environment is a testament to how domesticated we've become and how isolated we are, that we need to carry life support with us, like as if we're going to the moon or to Mars. But we're actually on our own planet, but we don't know how to use the resources that are available to us, so we have to bring them all in. And it gets complicated because now we have in the West here this idea of the leave no trace ethic in going into nature. So that was something I grew up with, which is like, if you're going to go into, let's say, the national forest here, where you guys just came from, If we were going to go into that national forest, the idea is don't start a fire with wood, bring your camp stove. And that seems good because you'll see less damage to the landscape initially. But it also means that somewhere they have to mine the propane, and then somewhere they have to bottle the propane into these aluminum containers, and somebody has to manufacture the stove in a factory, and all this pollution that comes out of that just so I can not damage the nature that I go into. It's like, well, you can damage that nature, but let's leave this nature pristine. And we have this very, it's sort of like, you'll see, I've heard it said, and I can't speak on behalf of First Nations people or Native American people here on this continent. I won't try to, but I have heard a sentiment echoed several times. When people from our culture see the reservations and they'll see what looks like a lot of garbage, and sometimes it'll be like cars rusting out over here, plastic strewn about in people's yards and stuff, and be like, man, why do they not just clean that up? And for them, what I've heard this said and echoed several times is like, you guys just think that if you go bury it over there, it goes away. And we don't think like that, right? So we have this idea that, well, we designate this for destruction and we'll put all the stuff there so we can keep this looking really clean. It's like a shell game. We just keep moving stuff around, forgetting that, hey, the environment's one contiguous, interconnected thing. And this is a testament to how we relate to it. Right? It's like, well, I want to keep my face really pretty, but I'm going to scratch up and cut up my legs or something. You know, it's like it's all one body, and we live on that body, and we're interacting with it like we came from another planet, and we're not from here, and we don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, I think that's important for people to get. This idea of like a lunar base or a trip to Mars, we're not talking about something that's going on next week. We have no backup plan here. This is the placenta or whatever. This is the womb. Like this earth is what we have. We don't even know if we could survive out there. It's extremely unrealistic that that's how our future goes, right? If you look at the rise and fall of civilizations through time, it's very unrealistic. The probability's low. We need to bank on protecting this place, not running somewhere else and then destroying that one and going to the next one. If we're going to do that, we need to have a different ethic with how we interact with the landscape. And it's not going to come from just recycling and trying to leave no trace in the environment. It's got to come from people having meaningful interactions with the landscape that can't be replaced by something else. You could look at what I do, which is hunt, fish, and forage food. And you could think like it's a hobby, because I don't really need to. I can go right down to the supermarket. I have the resources, I have a vehicle, I have the money to go buy all my food if I want. But I choose to hunt, fish, and forage. It looks to some people like it's my hobby, like, oh, it's just golf or frisbee or whatever other hobby. And for me, it's like, no, it's not that. It's not a sport. It's probably the best way to say it is like a practice. Most people who meditate don't think of their meditation as a sport. Right? They don't think of their yoga usually as a sport. It's a practice, right? It takes discipline to show up and do it. Well, harvesting and processing your own food takes quite a lot of discipline. It provides subsistence. It provides calories for me. But I spend probably sometimes more resources doing it than I actually get. So it's not really subsistence, and it's not really a sport or a hobby. It's a practice that alters how I interact with landscapes. Now when I move through landscapes, these are like a kitchen to me. It's like an extension of me. It's part of my home. If Walmart wants to put a store into a landscape where I harvest food, who's the first person out there to say, hey, no, this place needs to remain an open space? Not the environmentalist back in the city who's just actually using all those resources and probably going to shop at that Walmart. For sure, they believe in caring for the environment, but at such a level of removal that they can fall into these ideas of like carbon offset credits, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we'll destroy that, but we'll fix something over here. Whereas I'm like, no, you can't destroy that. Is important. I fish there, I hunt there, I get my food there. So I'm a stakeholder in caring for that landscape. And what I've noticed is when people have these meaningful sustainably extractive relationships, they care about a place. And that's one of the things about Indigenous people. When you move peoples around, they are no longer adapted to place, and now they suffer. And for me, if you stick me in another place, I don't know the plants there. I don't know the animals there. I've spent a lot of time, invested a lot of energy into learning this place. So it's not that a landscape is not replaceable to me. And that's why you become a staunch protector of a place once you have a meaningful interaction with the landscape. And when I say meaningful, I mean like my cells in my body contain carbon that come from 100 plants off this landscape and a dozen animals that I have personally harvested and eaten. I am made of those things. Like, I will protect them. They're like family and friends to me. It's not like, it's not the way people feel about their food at the supermarket.